Hello and welcome to the December 2023 ENSO seminar. So I am delighted to be joined today by Dr. Karin Kukkonen, who is Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of Oslo and a member of the Academy of Europe. Karin is also convener of the Research and Education Initiative, Literature, Cognition and Emotion, and has published in the areas of poetics, narratology, and also the development of the novel. And it's work with the novel that we'll be hearing from Karin today about. So I'm very grateful for you joining us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
So as I was just saying to Karin there before we came on, one of the work in which I sort of first came across her work was a co-written book on the embodiment of reading, and to explore the embodied aspects of something that is ostensibly as abstract and disembodied or almost sort of dreamlike as reading is an angle that was kind of new to me, but also as soon as I started reading Karin's work, sort of the embodied aspect of it are sort of brought to the fore and made obvious and interesting. And it'll be interesting then to sort of unpack some of that and to look at some of the ways in which our experience can get caught up in the physical bodily facts of reading and getting involved in particular with a novel. But as we sort of often do, as we get things started, we might go immediately to commercial break. And I think this morning, Karin, you are going to actually suggest a novel to us, is that right?
I am. I'll just share the screen. So now you should be seeing my PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah. So this is the book I'm going to plug. It's a novel by the Italian author Elsa Morante. The English translation is called House of Liars. It's action-packed. There is romance, fantastic. It's got everything. I decided to plug this book. Well, first and foremost, because I've just restarted reading it, but also because I came across an interview with Morante where she was asked about what the perfect New Year's Eve looks like for her. And she says, well, it involves eating chocolates, drinking Piedmont wine, listening to Mozart, and reading Stendhal. And I think reading this book, House of Liars, sort of gives you the written impression of what that must be like, that kind of sensory richness and, yeah, just sheer pleasure of enjoyment. It's a great read. The book itself, I've got it here. You can see this is also enough to get you from Christmas to the New Year. So if you're wondering what to do in those empty days, I highly recommend Elsa Morante's House of Liars.
Superb. Thank you very much. I think our first novel recommendation in the ENSO commercial break, I think there, breaking new ground as we move. So we have a few people watching live, and when we get to the discussion section later on, if there are comments from the YouTube channel, I will relay them into our discussion. But I think that all that remains then is for me to invite you to present the December 2023 ENSO seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll just move this. There we are. So I think I may be the first literary scholar to present, not only the first person to actually plug a novel. And because of that reason, and because, as Marek said in the beginning, it seems so strange to think of the novel as an embodied, an object engaging our embodied cognition. I will also give a couple of shout outs to other people who work in the field of literature and 4E cognition as we move through this talk. I've called it the novel as a Lifeworld technology because that is sort of one of the fundamental ways in which I think we can understand the novel as what it is, what it does, and why it has been so successful for several hundred years now, and why we're still reading it, even as our media ecology is moving in quite different directions. This notion of the novel as a life world technology, I developed it in a book which is officially called For E-Cognition in 18th Century Fiction. That was the request of the publisher. Its subtitle is How the Novel Found Its Feet. And that was also the title of the original project from which the book emerged. And I think it gives a much better impression of what I'm trying to do with the book. The idea behind the book is to say, well, the novel in the 18th century, and I'm talking here about 18th century Britain, when the novel famously gains huge cultural prominence. That cultural prominence is actually to do with the fact that the novel learns to capitalize on embodied features of language. So we know, of course, that language comprehension is very much predicated on embodied meaning making in the world, but also, of course, on the embodied resonances that we experience when we hear, for example, action verbs, etc. And one of the ways in which you can think about the language in which a novel is written and how it creates those immersive fictional worlds is as a language that triggers exactly that kind of embodied meaning making. So my original hypothesis for the book was that the novel in 18th century Britain develops a particularly effective use of embodied language, and thereby develops what we call realism today. That the novel becomes culturally prominent because it manages to mirror reality through an effective language of realism. Now, that hypothesis went the way of all hypotheses, or many hypotheses at least, when it met the sort of empirical reality when I started working on these novels. Because I realized that I had run up against something which I would call the curse of realism. The curse of realism, I'm thinking of it in terms of the curse of knowledge, which you're probably familiar with, this phenomenon that if you know the solution to a math problem, it's quite difficult to explain to someone who doesn't know the solution yet how to get there. So teachers, for example, need to be people who get past that curse of knowledge to put themselves into the shoes of someone who doesn't know how the math problem gets solved. And I think the 18th century novelists similarly didn't know where the novel was going to go. So when we talk about realism today and the sort of standards of realist novel, we are thinking of 19th century novelists. We are thinking of George Eliot and Flaubert. But that was not a target for an 18th century novelist. So I think this idea that the novel gets progressively better at something is actually an expression of this curse of realism, that we expect it to get closer to some kind of gold standard of realism. But that is actually not the case, because these novelists in the 18th century were highly experimental. They tried out multiple different things. And yes, one of the things that happened was that they developed new ways of using language to create immersive narratives. But actually, the most interesting thing was that it wasn't only the way in which they wrote, but also how they instructed people to read, how they instructed people to use books, that had a very distinctly not only embodied, but also enacted and extended dimension. For example, in the mid-18th century, serialization becomes invented for the novel. So the novel gets cliffhangers as it becomes embedded in the magazines. And with that chunking of the narrative, you also have a way of pacing how you provide various kinds of engagement. And if you are part of a magazine where there are different elements, different kinds of articles about different aspects of the world, you can, of course, also coordinate the kind of narrative that you tell with these other kinds of elements of the world. You can basically turn the novel into something that helps you navigate this enormously growing knowledge economy that you have in the 18th century. At the same time, novelists, as novelists, wrote very immersive texts that really take you into other worlds. They also worked at something which I think today we would call slow reading. They also worked at ways of writing language that makes you slow down and think and reflect on what you've just read. And novelists draw on various aspects of life writing, for example, writing letters or writing diaries, and bring that in dialogue with their fiction writing. So by the time I'd actually done all the research around how the novel found its feet, it was not so much a question of creating effective embodied language, even though novelists did that at the time. It was really a question of how the novel became embedded in a series of contexts, becomes part of a practice, let's say, of navigating this 18th century life world. And let's not forget, the 18th century is the age of revolution. It's the time where people felt everything was changing. So the novel gets integrated into the life world and its practices. And I think that is one of the ways in which we can account for it becoming the cultural force that it still is today. In the conclusion to the book, which is called The Novel as a Life World Technology, I try to provide a larger theoretical framework for it. And for that, I draw on Don Ihde's technophenomenology, where he speaks, for example, about the ways in which technological innovations go hand in hand with a changing perception of the life world and, of course, scientific progress. So he talks, for example, about the invention of the telescope and the way in which that not only allows you, of course, to do astronomy in a different way, but how it more generally expands the reach of perception as we can look much further into the night sky. And I think in a quite similar way, the novel is a life world technology that allowed people in the 18th century to navigate their life world in ways that wouldn't have been available to them otherwise. And I think this is also a function that the novel still can have today. The model on which I built this argument is Clark and Chalmers' extended mind hypothesis, and in particular the way in which they see language. And of course, Andy Clark's Supersizing the Mind has a whole chapter on language, which is also quite relevant for this argument. Clark and Chalmers write, language thus construed is not a mirror of our inner states, but a complement to them. It serves as a tool whose role it is to extend cognition in ways that onboard devices cannot. Having language allows us to extend, in other words, the reach of our cognition. And I would say having written language that allows you to construct fictional scenarios is a way in which you can extend the reach of your emotions and cognitive processes. Of course, that extension is made in a parallel with the telescope and visual perception. But there are, I think, more specific ways in which we can show or discuss the ways in which the novel extends cognitive processes. The first example would be the way in which it allows you to attend to interoception, to the perception of your inner physical states. The heartbeat would be one example. So the standard situation is, of course, that you sit and read a novel. And I think that is exactly the crucial point here. In most contexts, we can pay attention to what's going on around us because we keep interoception stable. In fact, we can be quite adventurous, exploring everything that's going on around us. But we don't want to have an upset tummy when we do that. So in this homeostatic balance between interoception and exteroception, we generally try to have a stable interoception so that we can be more explorative, more adventurous when it comes to perceiving, exploring things in the world around us. Now, in the case of reading, this is the other way around, because when we read, we sit still. We try to have a comfortable chair that we don't need to get out of anytime soon. Quite often, we also like it to be quiet. We don't want to have any kind of distraction around us, really. So what happens when you read, and I think that is probably one of the reasons why reading seems so disembodied, is that we actually stabilize exteroception. And now if this homeostatic balance applies, we then should be able to be a lot more adventurous with perceiving and exploring our inner and emotional states. And I think that is something that certainly happens when you read a novel. You suddenly become aware of how you react on a very basic, very fundamental level. For example, whether you like a character, whether you think they've done the right thing, but also on more narrative levels. For example, something that happens to a character evokes a memory in you, or something that a character acquires is something that you would like to have too in your future, that kind of thing. So these inner perceptions and inner explorations, I think, are something that are facilitated exactly by both the format of reading on paper, mostly, reading in a quiet situation, the typical reading practice, I think, around the novel. And that attention to inner perceptions, I think, puts the novel in a very interesting dialogue with meditation practices. At least that's an argument I make in this article there. And it would, I think, be a very interesting target also for comparative empirical exploration, how reading and meditation are comparable when it comes to this interoceptive exploration. Another way in which the novel extends the reach of cognition is the particular combination of immersion and reflection that it enables. The embodied language in particular, I think, enables readers both to immerse themselves in a very particular situation model, a very particular fictional world, but at the same time, because this is not actually you, you can also reflect what is happening. Merja Polvinen discusses this phenomenon in terms of joint attention, where both you and the narrator together pay attention to what's going on in the fictional world, while at the same time you always constantly maintain attention to what the narrator is telling you, and that this narrator is telling you something. In an article on Jesuit poetics, I've tried to show that literary texts can be understood exactly as designer environments where immersion and reflection go hand in hand. And that certainly 18th century literary theory quite consciously reflected on that particular property of the novel. A third way in which the novel can extend cognition is taking elements of the life world across history. So for the purposes of how the novel found its feet, I was, of course, interested in the 18th century life world. And I suggested that the novel looks, feels, and reads differently at different points in time, exactly because it unfolds in a very close entanglement with the life world and other technologies at the time. However, at the same time, it is also true that we can still read 18th century novels and understand them reasonably well. And we still read Jane Austen from the early 19th century. This is an argument that Terence Cave makes in the book Thinking with Literature, where he talks about literary affordances, so the way in which literary texts are affordances for different modes of thinking and feeling, and underlines that these literary affordances are in fact something that works across time, that we can still, with our cognitive equipment today, use the literary affordances of texts from a different century. I'll now provide a very brief illustration of how at least two of these extensions look like in practice. This is from a book that Marek mentioned that I wrote together with Marco Caracciolo. Marco is also somebody who's done a lot of work around inactive cognition and literature. Well, the book is called With Bodies, and it's a basic introduction to the ways in which narrative theory can profit from a 4E perspective. One of the examples that we discuss is from Hilary Mantel's historical novel Wolf Hall, which is set at the time of Henry VIII and is told from the perspective of the courtier Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell is a scheming, sort of Machiavellian kind of character, and he is behind the plot to bring down Anne Boleyn, to accuse her of adultery. And the scene that I want to talk about is at the core of Cromwell basically building a fake case against Boleyn, accusing her of having adulterous relationships with 4 young men. This is entirely constructed, and the way in which Cromwell does this, I think, is very interesting for our purposes, because the way in which he does it draws on a particular cultural technique that was very prominent in the Renaissance. It's the technique of the memory palace or the memory theater that, for example, Francis Yates has written about. So the idea of a memory palace goes back to antiquity, actually, and it is to do with the practical challenge of remembering the speech that you then have to deliver on the forum. And the way in which you do this is you put your arguments into a mental image, and then you place those images around your house. And as you go to the forum to deliver your speech, in your mind, you walk through your house and you pick up all these images, so you remember at least everything that you needed to say in that speech. It's a very simple model of this kind of art of memory practice, this cultural technique. In the Renaissance, this has turned into a very complex system that in many contexts is even used to provide conceptual order, in some cases for the entire world. And I refer again to Francis Yates. Here, Thomas Cromwell actually uses that kind of spatial organization of memory to build the case of Anne Boleyn. In this scene where you've got the quotation on the screen, he has just started accusing the first young man of being involved with Anne Boleyn, and when he's confused as to why he was chosen as a suspect, Cromwell says, "I must take your mind back." And he reminds him of a drama performance where Cardinal Wolsey, who was his predecessor as advisor to the king, was ridiculed as he had just died, and there was a performance of 4 demons carrying the cardinal to hell. And now Norris, the young man, starts to remember. Himself and Boleyn, that is Anne Boleyn's brother, grasping the victim's hands, Brereton and Weston laying hold of him by his feet, 4 of them tossing the scarlet figure, tumbling and kicking him, 4 men who for a joke turned the cardinal into a beast. They took away his wit, his kindness, and his grace, and made him a howling animal, groveling on the boards and scrabbling with his paws. And then Morris actually remembers that after the performance comes to an end, that there was actually Thomas Cromwell leaning against the paneling, silent, wrapped in a robe of mourning, black. And he realizes that he is not getting out of that court case. Indeed, as the novel then carries on and Cromwell builds his case, it is no surprise at all that Norris is the left forepaw, but that Boleyn, the brother of Anne Boleyn, is the right forepaw, and that the other 2 young men, right hindpaw, left hindpaw, are the other 2 accused. So he basically reproduces that spatially organized memory image in the court case that he is going to build. So what we have here, I think very interestingly, a very specific, very historically specific kind of practice that Mantell, at the beginning of the novel, actually quite explicitly introduces. So she helps readers understand what is going on, how the art of memory is invented. Cromwell tells us that this is a situation where somebody sits at the table at a dinner party, gets called out by a messenger. At that moment, the house collapses and everybody dies. But the person who was called out can remember or can identify all the bodies because he remembers the seating order at the table. He remembered the names, the places, some sour and bloated, some blithe, some bored. He remembered exactly where everyone was sitting at the moment the roof fell in. What Mantell does here is she provides not just the information that allows us to understand exactly this practice of the memory theatre and how Cromwell uses it, but she also provides exactly the emotional and very dramatic impetus that is behind that. This court case is exactly the moment where the roof falls in the Tudor system and around the world of Anne Boleyn and her court. So what Mantell does here, arguably, is she provides both an immersive and a reflective dimension. We are both part of this Renaissance world. We think together with Thomas Cromwell and Henry Norris and the other characters, while at the same time we're also capable of reflecting on what Mantell asks us to do here. And I think it is also an excellent demonstration of this historical mobility of literary affordances that Terence Cave is talking about. Now, I've spoken about practices and the way in which readers' practices tie in with the novel. But of course, this also goes for authors' practices. In How the Novel Found Its Feet, I also discuss how authors write, in particular through the case study of Frances Burney, where I had the opportunity to look at her manuscripts and try to reconstruct, with the help of especially extended mind ideas, how she must have worked. And I give two references here to people who have looked at manuscripts informed by 4E cognition ideas. What Burney does is this is a manuscript for one of her plays. She provides a big sheet in the background where you've got the scene. You can probably read this scene 5, then the names of characters, and then a short description of the setting. And what she then does is she has little scraps of paper that she puts on top of these bigger sheets, but she can move them around. So this is a sort of aleatory way of writing dialogue. She doesn't have to decide what's going to be the first line, that she can change 100 times. She doesn't even have to decide which character is going to speak that line. That is also something that she can change all the time. She later on will then copy the small scraps onto the big sheet, but even there, she can still add different passages if she wants to. And even in the next stage, which is a little booklet, as you can perhaps see, she has these little scraps attached in a certain sequence, but they are attached with pins. So she can also pull out the pins and then reassemble them again. They are not fixed with glue or anything like that. So Burney basically has what Lamorce Malafors would describe as material agency in her encounter with the pen and the paper, but also the pins and the scissors, arguably, creating a particular kind of aleatory practice in writing. And I think this is another dimension where 4E cognition and literary studies can very productively interact. In fact, this is something that I have pursued in my most recent project, which I very briefly sketch out. It's a project on literary writing and how we can think about creativity in a embodied cognitive way. This comes certainly out of the work that I've done with Bernie's very aleatory manuscripts. But I think in most cases, authors will be very sensitive to contingency. They will be very sensitive to things that don't have to be the way they appear to us. And that's exactly, I think, the creative energy that goes into our engagement with the material world. Just some very brief examples of the kind of material that I've looked at for this project. For example, Italo Calvino's novel, The Castle of Crossed Destinies, which is a novel that unfolds through tarot cards that are being drawn and placed on the table. So the story is basically told through what happens on these cards. And the sequence is, of course, entirely contingent. Again, we have a kind of material engagement, the way in which the cards are placed on the table. You have reproductions in the novel itself of the patterns that the cards take. So you can trace the narrative discourse also in a spatial sense as you're reading it. Another example would be authors I've interviewed, and here I just want to mention the case of Gwenaëlle Aubry, who is not only a novelist and a writer, but who also performs her text with musical accompaniment on the theatre stage. So there is a feedback loop, I think, between the rhythm and the embodied performance of her texts and the practice of writing, of course. And the final example, Charlotte Bronte's little books, which are really tiny, so they're about this size. They're about, the size of a large stamp. And she writes little stories in these mini folios as, a young adolescent, as a girl. And it's, I think, very interesting to see how that kind of material agency then can also be traced into her work as a grown-up novelist, as the author of Jane Eyre. I'll leave it here, and I hope to have given a little, very fast, admittedly, but hopefully intriguing overview of the kind of connections that can emerge between readers, writers, novels, their bodies, and the life world in which they're embedded. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So the yes, there's a wealth and richness to the embodiment of reading that, again, something that it kind of seems obvious once you pointed it out, but unless we give it a sort of an explicit or deliberate consideration, it so easily slips into the background. I was particularly taken with your point about the balance, the homeostasis you mentioned in the interaction between interoception and exteroception. And I mean, again, it's a thing that makes perfect sense once you pause to consider it. That in order to bring sort of subtle reactions to the fore in terms of our own responses and our own sort of consideration and sort of awareness of our own responses to text, it's a sort of a vital process to block out the world around us. And I wonder if I could ask you to say just a little bit more about the dialogue with meditation that you mentioned there. I mean, one of the definitions of meditation that has always stuck in my mind, you don't see it around too much, but it's the notion of mental silence. But that silence, or what we might consider a silence, might also just be the reduction of noise, which could be, conversely, not an entirely silence, but just a singular focus. And we're back to that whole issue of immersion, which is that first, I think it was the second extension that you mentioned. So is there are there sort of particular aspects beyond that, allowing interoceptive aspects to come to the fore, that are in play in that dialogue with meditation, or is it really just that sort of crucial focus of that balance between the our awareness of the world and our awareness of ourselves?
Yeah, I think that balance is basically what underlies it. But of course, you can create that balance in other ways too. I think meditation is an interesting contrast case, because in many cases it is about, well, I mean, look at things as they arise in your mind. I think that is a definition that is often given. And then, of course, in many cases, and I know there are very many different kinds of meditation practices. So I wouldn't have to talk to a specialist to actually get a better grip on that. But my understanding of it is that you are able to pay attention to thoughts as they arise. And then as you get better at exactly the attention side of it, you are also capable to, put them aside or create that moment of, mental silence, as you called it. So it is, I think, something to do with how you learn to manage your attention vis-a-vis mind wandering, if you will, because these thoughts that arise, they come out of our, the default mode network, they come out of, the spontaneous cognition. And I think thoughts can just as well arise when you read, but they're scaffolded exactly by the narrative. They're scaffolded by what is happening to the characters. So it works in a different way, in the sense that, I mean, the paper that I quoted is entirely speculative, but it seems to me that when you're reading a literary text, the kind of mind wandering that you have to do, in a way, is linked to, you relate yourself to the characters and to what's happening to them through your memory and your imaginative projections. So I think the kind of mind wandering that is going on there is already scaffolded, and that scaffolding provides a kind of attentional focus, which is also the thing that you're after in meditation. So I think that that's one of the ways in which we could, look at productive similarities and differences. Another way, I think, is the way in which reading always unfolds over time. And of course, as you're meditating, you also need to keep that attention going over time, and that gets progressively harder. Whereas reading a novel, if you're in the reading process, at least for a certain while, it gets progressively more easy, because you're familiar with that fictional world, you get to know those characters, etc. So I think there is a way in which exactly the scaffolding of the text that guided mind wandering, guided attention, I think it's both, is a way that allows you to maintain these inner explorations over a relatively long period of time, where if you're not a very experienced meditator, that would be incredibly hard. So I think there is a lot more to be explored, but the basic setup, I would argue, is on the basis of this exteroception, interoception balance.
So I'm fascinated as well by, so you mentioned essentially the construction of a scaffold there to enable the reader to develop skills at immersion and focus. And you mentioned earlier on in the talk about the ways in which, particularly in the development of the 18th century novel, the ways in which authors, and not just authors, I guess, but also publishers and the wider social systems that were in negotiation at the time, taught readers how to read differently. And I guess I'm particularly curious as to I didn't quite get down the particular phrase you used, but you did explicitly mention writers teaching their readers how to read at one point, or made some reference to it. And I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit, maybe give us an example of it, because it kind of sort of very much illustrates the agency of the author as not just someone who is making marks on a page and then leaving them to be found, but is really intending to be in dialogue with an audience, even if they might never hear the audience respond to the particular marks on the page. So what kinds of things were, what practices were introduced there, and how were they scaffolded in kind of practical terms?
That is a very big question. But it is, I think, a very important one. Because, of course, the novel, when it starts in the 18th century, is not a prestigious genre at all. I mean, this is, if one of the things that quite often strikes me is the way in which we talk about digitization today, that everything is accelerated all the time, that we're not paying attention anymore, that we're all getting really stupid because of Google. That is exactly the kind of worry that people had around the novel, that these texts do not reward slow, close reading. They're not like the Bible or your catechism, which you have to read multiple times and have to pay proper attention to. They will, basically rot our minds. That is the reception that the novel got.
Inevitable moral panic of the new.
Yeah, the moral. It's really striking how similar. I mean, just on the level of the cognitive processes that seem to be affected, how similar the discourses are. So I think that kind of medium technology change is there. And of course, writers needed to respond to that. And most of them wanted to respond to that. So I think one of the developments that happens in the 18th century is that writers show that a novel can be put to educational uses. And I mean, the most obvious way of doing that is modeling. So you've got a character in the novel learning how to read properly, and thereby, exactly through that loop of immersion and reflection, you also educate your readers. One of the novels I discuss in the book is called The Female Quixote by Charlotte Lennox, which is where you've got the main protagonist, who is a young woman who reads these massive French romances where everyone is very chivalric and yes, gives long speeches, etc., etc. And she thinks the world must work like that, which in a realist 18th century setting is kind of a problem. But at the same time, it also gives her actually a lot of power, because nobody can predict in any situation what she's going to be doing, because nobody else has read these novels. So there is a very interesting push and pull going on. And as she is, this is one of the precursors of the Bildungsroman, the novel of development. As she begins to understand what it takes to live in a society, she also begins to understand how to use her knowledge of these novels properly in certain social situations. I mean, this is something that Don Quixote in Cervantes doesn't learn, but in the 18th century, that feedback loop is exactly being built.
And it's fascinating then as well, because of the logic of the individual, again, usually a monastic author. I don't mean literally necessarily there, just this idea that the novel springs forth from the author, but to step back and see them as in the middle of a process rather than at the start of one. And in fact, that process having the kind of loop that you're talking about there is, I don't know, it's eye-opening to me. It's sort of very much a change in perspective. And it strikes, I mean, from a kind of inactive perspective, where there is this sort of recognition of the continuous negotiation of the ground, so there being no one solid ground. The fact that your initial hypothesis that, well, they were going to get more realistic, and that's part of what led them to sort of develop in power, except that it turns out that the realism is a continuously negotiated and constantly recreated thing. I mean, I'm just thinking about the phrase realistic and gritty is in modern sort of critical phrases now. That grittiness, it seems to be essential to what we consider realistic now. But again, presumably just part of the current fashion for particular literary styles and even just styles of criticism.
Yeah, I mean, there's the trouble with many kinds of realism, especially the sort of realist and gritty, is that it very quickly turns into cliche, because we get these predictable, phrasings, adjectives, etc., that people tend to use and reuse. And I mean, when that happens, it of course doesn't work at all anymore to give you the illusion that this has anything to do with reality. It's very much marked as that is, written language, fictional, etc. So I think it has to be a constant push and pull. It has to be constantly responding to what's going on in the larger society, life world, whatever context, whatever boundary you want to draw around the novel.
Is there an extent then to which, I mean, that would seem to humble any strong ambitions about that sort of historical reach then? Now, I guess I mean, put in mind the fact that she drew on Mantell in particular, I think is fascinating. I don't know if you're aware of her Reith lectures. She gave the BBC Reith lectures, I think, back in 2016 or something. But one of the points she made there was, everything that we create in terms of a recording of experience or a presentation of experience or a narrative, is editorial decisions right from the get-go, can never be complete, is always perspectival, and therefore is always sort of very tightly limited. And so that kind of dual aspect that you mentioned when discussing her presentation of the memory palace, where on the one hand we have, as a modern reader, we can see sort of Mantell's presentation of the narrative and can understand it as such, but as an immersed reader in the Tudor period that Mantell is inviting us into, as it were, we're also getting some understanding or experience of that period. To what extent can we maintain that for historical texts written at the time? So we know Mantell knows who her readers are, and it, as you say, is very much responding to who she, she's got a target audience and she's speaking to a particular group, on the basis of shared experiences that she'll understand and education that she'll expect and so on. If we read, if I were to go and read Austen or Flaubert now and so on, to what extent can those literary affordances, as you mentioned it, and that sort of reaching across history, how can we increase our confidence of it, or at least be adequately conscious of it and of the limitations?
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously limitations in the sense that, I mean, we didn't grow up in a society like Jane Austen, but I think exactly because you have a lot of knowledge given in the novel itself, and if you've read, all the Austen novels, and also perhaps you were curious about the period, so you read a couple of biographies of Austen. So I think there is quite a lot of material that you can draw on to draw inferences, where everything that is implicit or open in the text itself, you can supply. I think you will not supply it in the same way as somebody who reads these at the beginning of the 19th century will, just because we have, at least a century of feminism, for example. But I think that makes it actually even more interesting, because we can then also see, different ways in which inferences can be drawn, exactly because we have that kind of historical distance. So I think for the most part, I think most novels have a way of telling you how they need to be read. So they will provide a sort of minimum of foundation for you to navigate them, just by narrators telling you what you need to know or characters modeling it for you. And that can still remain relatively strange just because it's informed by a decorum that is not, and I mean, the very word decorum, I think, is not something anybody would use today anymore, but it is informed by a set of social standards that we don't share. And you can, I think, if you really get immersed in the period, and I think this is what Mantell must have been doing, preparing for the Cromwell trilogy. I think you can get a lot more precise in the inferences that you draw, exactly because you've learned so much more about what the different possibilities are, how they, what kind of practices they had, like the memory palaces or memory theatre, etc. So I think there are ways in which you can get a good deal more precise in drawing historically specific inferences, or in using what Terence Cave calls the literary affordances in more specific ways. But you can, I think, just as much supply contemporary ones, and I think that tension is actually where literature often lives.
Yeah. No, there's the concept of material agency then as well sort of strikes me as if you think of the novel as a technology that is being built by other forms of technology, you know, the materials we use to create a novel, and as they've changed and as they've also changed the novel, are again sort of offer ways of thinking about how narratives are constructed and how narratives can be constructed too. So I'm afraid I don't have a coherent question on this one. It's just something that I was particularly taken aback by in your description of Bernie's process. That Bernie's process does not, you know, it's clearly not a normal thing. Are there sort of particular aspects of her work that you think are sort of enabled by that you know, are visible in the end result, or could the end result have been produced by a different process, by something a little bit more linear or traditional, as it were?
Yeah, that is a very good question. So one of the things I suggest with respect to Bernie's practice is that she uses that practice not only for the plays, but also for her novels. So the problem, and this is an enormous problem with anything that's older than the 19th century, is that often you don't have a complete manuscript dossier. So you can't trace all the changes. You have to make inferences on the basis of what you have. So we have very early drafts for the plays, but not for the novels. Now, if we assume that she uses the same practice for the novels as well, and I think there are reasons to do so, then we arrive at a way of writing where what one character says could also have been said by another character. So direct speech becomes very mobile and flexible. And I think that is one of the things that contributes to Bernie using free and direct discourse. So the phenomenon that you have a sentence that is delivered, but it's not the narrator who says it. There's also no speech tag like he said or she thought in the narrative discourse, but it must be one of the characters. So you have something that is very characteristic, the way in which a character speaks, but it's not unambiguously attributed to that character, but embedded in the narrative discourse. You've got a mobility of ways of speaking that becomes, of course, much more elaborate with, well, again, 19th century authors. And I think this practice of cutting up dialogue is one of the ways in which, which probably sparked Bernie towards that development.
No, it's a fascinating notion, and it delightfully brings up as you say, once you have that fluidity of, you know, a given phrase can appear connected to any given character and so on. The idea of the narrative is something that emerges from, rather than is sort of propelled in a single direction, but emerges from this kind of interaction between the author and her text, is yeah, it's a delightfully evocative aspect of things, or illustration of the process. So we are we're sort of very close to time. So I appreciate you very much. I appreciate you're in the middle of research at present. So I am very grateful for you giving your time for our December seminar, and for introducing the wealth of embodied narrative research, which I think is, I don't know, it looks like a good way to spend Christmas. Precisely, you know, as you mentioned, bury ourselves anew in the quiet meditative practice of what I imagine is fairly typical for most academics come the next few weeks.
Well, I think if I could provide a more one more justification for doing that, then my work here is done. Thank you very much for inviting me and for giving me the possibility to present this.
Very good. Karin Kukkonen, thank you very much. And to those watching, we will see you in the new year. We're going to take a hiatus, a little bit of a longer hiatus than normal. We'll be back in February with another ENSO seminar. And